March 1945, the western bank of the Rhine River just before dawn. Cold mist rises from the water, drifting low and heavy, blurring the opposite shore into a pale gray wall. The river moves slowly but with immense weight, carrying broken branches, fragments of wood, and the memory of centuries of wars fought along its banks. On the German side, ruined villages sit in silence. Church towers are cracked, rooftops collapsed, roads turned into mud by retreating boots and shattered armor. German officers stand wrapped in greatcoats, binoculars pressed to their eyes, watching the far shore. They expect delay. They expect caution. They expect caution. They expect the river to protect them, at least for a while. Rivers always have. For generations of European soldiers, rivers meant time. They meant pause. They meant engineers working for days, sometimes weeks under fire, struggling to span moving water with scarce materials. The Rhine, in particular, carried mythic weight. It was not just a physical barrier, but a psychological one, celebrated in German songs, protected in German doctrine, and believed to be a final shield against invasion from the West. German command assumed that if the Allies reached the Rhine intact, the war would slow there. Perhaps negotiations could begin. Perhaps the front could stabilize. At the very least, the river would force the enemy to stop, to gather, to plan. They were wrong. The importance of this moment had been building for years. Since 1942, American industry had been quietly preparing for a war measured not just in battles, but in movement. Factories in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan did not only produce tanks and guns. They produced steel trusses, prefabricated bridge sections, pontoons, Bailey Bridge components, and floating roadways. U.S. Army engineers trained relentlessly, not only in construction, but in speed. Manuals emphasized hours, not days. Exercises were timed. Failures were studied and corrected. I guess. The lesson was simple and repeated until it became instinct. Momentum saves lives. German doctrine, by contrast, assumed that engineering units would operate under severe constraint. Shortages of steel, fuel, and trained labor had plagued the Reich since 1943. Bombing had crippled transport networks. Bridges destroyed by retreating German units could not easily be replaced. What the Germans expected from their enemy was what they themselves were experiencing: delay, improvisation, and exhaustion. As the Allied armies surged eastward after the breakout from Normandy, the pace alone unsettled German officers. Divisions appeared where intelligence said there should be none. Supply columns followed armor with uncanny precision. When bridges were blown, new ones appeared behind advancing units with alarming regularity. Reports filtered up the chain of command describing American engineers working at night, under shell fire, assembling bridges as if on factory floors, rather than battlefields. Still, the Rhine was different. It was wide, deep, fast, and symbolically immense. German officers believed that even the Americans would have to slow here. At first light, the riverbank stirs. On the Allied side, engines hum softly. Trucks roll forward in carefully rehearsed order. Cranes, pontoons, and bridging trucks move with mechanical certainty. Engineers unload steel sections that have already been measured, labeled, and rehearsed back in England and France. There is no confusion, no shouting. The work begins almost quietly, as if this were a routine exercise rather than the final barrier to Germany itself. German observers struggle to understand what they are seeing. There is no long artillery preparation, no dramatic pause. Instead, smoke drifts across the river, and within it, shapes begin to take form. Pontoons slide into the water, locked together with practiced efficiency. Steel trusses are carried forward by teams that move as one, each man knowing exactly where to stand, where to lift, where to lock a pin. Historical records from U.S. Army engineer units show the scale of preparation behind this moment. The 9th Army's engineers, for example, constructed a 1,100-foot pontoon bridge across the Rhine at Wesel in less than 6 hours. At Remagen, after the unexpected capture of the Ludendorff Bridge, American engineers repaired damage and reinforced the structure continuously, often under fire, allowing thousands of troops to cross before it finally collapsed days later. General Omar Bradley later noted that American engineers were as decisive to victory as any armored division. For German officers watching from the eastern bank, the emotional contrast is sharp and deeply unsettling. They had expected chaos. They had expected hesitation. Instead, they see order. They see abundance. Where German units rationed steel and fuel, the Americans seemed to have endless supplies. Where German engineers salvaged scrap, the Americans discard damaged sections and replace them instantly. One German staff report from March 1945 described the Allied bridging operations as industrial warfare brought directly to the front. Another officer later recalled that it felt less like fighting an army and more like trying to stop a moving factory. The sound becomes impossible to ignore. The steady clank of steel on steel, the low thrum of engines, the splash of pontoons hitting water. This sound repeats day after day, river after river, and it becomes a symbol in itself. Not a weapon firing, not a bomb falling, but construction. Creation in the midst of destruction. For German soldiers raised on the idea that war was about annihilation, this was deeply disorienting. American records show why this was possible. By 1944, the United States was producing more steel than all Axis powers combined. Engineer units were equipped with standardized bridge designs that could be assembled by almost any trained team. The Bailey Bridge, originally British in design but mass-produced by American factories, could be erected without heavy machinery, using manpower alone if necessary. Pontoon bridges could carry tanks within hours of first contact with water. The transformation this caused on the battlefield was profound. Rivers ceased to be defensive lines. They became inconveniences. German commanders who planned withdrawals based on river barriers found their timelines collapsing. Orders to hold until bridges are destroyed lost meaning when new bridges appeared downstream almost immediately. German ideology had long emphasized engineering prowess as a mark of national strength. Autobahns, dams, and fortifications were symbols of German modernity. To see American engineers outperform them not just in quality, but in speed and scale, struck at something deeper than tactics. It challenged the belief that Germany represented the pinnacle of industrial civilization. The recurring symbol in these encounters was steel. Cold, gray, unremarkable steel, not forged into weapons, but into roads. Steel that arrived in endless quantities, shaped not by desperation, but by planning. For American soldiers, steel bridges meant safety, supply, and forward motion. For German officers, they became symbols of inevitability. As the crossings multiplied, resistance weakened. German units on the eastern bank found themselves flanked almost as soon as they formed defensive lines. Retreat became chaotic. The river that was supposed to buy time instead marked the moment when time ran out. After the war, several German generals wrote about the shock of Allied logistics. General Friedrich von Mellenthin noted that American engineering capabilities rendered obsolete many of our traditional defensive concepts. Others spoke less formally but more honestly, describing the moment they realized the war was lost not because of one battle, but because they could not slow the enemy. The transformation was not only military, but psychological. German officers who had believed in the superiority of German planning and discipline were forced to confront a different reality. A democracy that could mobilize industry, science, and labor on a scale they had never imagined. A system that turned abundance into momentum. Wait, wrong. In the final weeks of the war, American engineers continued to build bridges over the Main, bridges over the Elbe, temporary structures that outlived the regime that tried to stop them. Soldiers crossed on them carrying rifles, rations, letters from home. Supply trucks followed, loaded with fuel and food. The war moved forward on steel beams laid by men whose names would never appear in history books. The epilogue of this story is quiet. Long after the guns fell silent, some of those temporary bridges were dismantled and reused. Others were replaced by permanent structures. Rivers returned to being rivers, but the lesson remained. Freedom in this war was not only defended with bullets, it was built with planning, with cooperation, with the ability to create faster than an enemy could destroy. On the banks of the Rhine, German officers learned that day that the strength of the United States was not just in its firepower, but in its capacity to connect, to span gaps, to move forward, to turn obstacles into pathways. Steel sank into water. Men crossed. And with each completed bridge, the old world receded, replaced by a future that moved not at the pace of fear, but at the speed of work.